We're going to get started here. There's other hearings going on. At some point, we'll have a quorum, and we'll be able to take some action on some of the hearings that we had this last fall because for different reasons, we weren't able to take votes this fall. So we have a whole set of items that I think the members were all given, and we'll probably stop at some point in the middle of the hearing at an appropriate moment to vote on those recommendations. Today's hearing is on the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, the out-of-state prison program. Again, obviously, we don't have a quorum, so I'm just going to launch into it with a little bit of an opening statement. I want to open by making a couple of caveats. It is clear that in 2006, the governor exercised his emergency powers with regard to our prison system, and that the actions that we're going to be hearing about today have all taken place under that framework. That does not mean that over the course of 4 years, CDCR should not have followed some semblance of normal competitive bidding processes for these contracts. And that's what we want to get into is the process by which CDCR entered into these agreements and extended them over time. This hearing is not about any vendors, whether they got a contract or didn't get a contract. Again, it's about the process that CDCR undertook to get us to the situation we find ourselves in now, which is a significant contract for over 8,000 prisoners that are going out of state and supposed to grow over the next couple of years. Finally, the last caveat is this isn't about the out-of-state placement policy itself. That's for policy committee to decide. Clearly, we're underway with this process. We have over 8,000 prisoners going out of state. The question is, are we getting the best value for that program that we possibly can get? That is the most important thing. That is what we are looking at here today. Thanks. You all could hear me, right? Okay. Just the folks at home. All three people who are watching. The last caveat is, again, that we're not looking at the policy of out-of-state placement. That's for policy committee to decide. We are looking at the process by which we entered into these contracts and over time extended the contracts from about $20 million originally to over $600 million currently. That is, by anybody's estimation, a steep increase, and we need to make sure that going forward we are getting the best value wherever that comes from, whether it's from the current vendor or other vendors or combination vendors, however that's done. As I've said before in this committee, it is important for government agencies to show what they're doing and how they're arriving at their decisions. There needs to be a level of transparency that we are not seeing in this instance. With that, Vice Chair Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, in these tough economic times and with our persistent deficit, it is really critical that we explore all of the areas to guarantee to taxpayers that their money is being spent wisely, efficiently, and effectively. And so to that extent, this committee's work is critically important. Obviously, we are operating under less than ideal circumstances within our prison system, a system whose health care is controlled by the federal receiver. A federal three-judge panel is dictating and monitoring our entire prison system. And the legislature has shown over the last number of years, obviously, that it is unwilling to build new prison facilities, thereby complicating the overcrowding issue, and obviously balancing all of this in the context of the possibility of a release of 1,000 or so prisoners is a very serious concern. Given all that and in all the situations and all the circumstances, however, this legislature, each one of us, the governor and his administration, must do whatever it can to provide accountability and transparency to the taxpayer. And so I'm looking forward to learning more about the situation here today. Thank you.
Thank you. We will start with an overview from the LAO, Paul Golosowski. I hope I pronounced that right.
Thanks, Paul Golosowski with the Legislative Analyst's Office. The committee asked us to present a brief overview of the program and also go into a little bit more detail on the procurement process that the department has used. You should have in front of you a handout that the sergeant distributed earlier that I'll be speaking from today. So if you turn to the first page of the handout, there's a brief overview of the program, its mission, and the current status. The California Out-of-State Correctional Facility Program, its acronym is COSEF, is administered by CDCR. The mission of the program is to transfer inmates to out-of-state private prison facilities, and the main purpose is to temporarily alleviate overcrowding in the state prison system, as the chair alluded to earlier. The department has about 8,000 inmates currently out of state. Inmates in these facilities are generally higher security levels, so they're level 2s and level 3s. If you're familiar with the security levels in the prison, it goes 1 through 4. So these are medium to high security. The inmates, most have been transferred involuntarily, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on that later. And most of the inmates that are out of state right now do not have serious medical or mental health issues. They've been screened for those sorts of issues prior to being transferred. So it's a somewhat specialized population that we've sent out of state. The department currently houses inmates out of state in facilities that are located in Arizona, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. They have a contract with one corporation that manages and runs all of these facilities, the Correction Corporations of America, or CCA. CCA is a private for-profit company that runs these facilities. And at the facilities, inmates do have certain programming opportunities, just like inmates at state-run facilities that would include education, vocational, and substance abuse programs. So if you turn to page 2 of the handout, I'll talk a little about how the program started. The chair went over it briefly as well. But in October 2006, the governor issued a state of emergency proclamation related to prison overcrowding. And this proclamation directed CDCR to immediately contract with and transfer inmates to out-of-state correctional facilities to relieve the overcrowding situation in the state prisons. Now, in addition, it's important to note that the measure also suspended statutory restrictions on the involuntary transfer of inmates, which I talked about earlier. So this allowed the department to transfer inmates out of state, even if they did not volunteer. It also outlined some criteria for selecting which inmates to transfer out of state. And finally, the governor's proclamation, which is the focus of the hearing today, it waived applicable state contracting laws, including requirements for competitive bidding. After the program started, a couple months later, in May 2007, the legislature took action as part of AB 900, which most of you are familiar with, to allow CDCR, to clarify in statute that CDCR would be allowed to transfer inmates out of state on an involuntary basis. The department was not getting enough volunteer inmates to go out of state. They were only able to get a couple hundred. So this allowed them to transfer inmates involuntarily. However, the legislature did put a sunset date on this provision, and that date is July 1st, 2011, or until the department had replaced all of the temporary beds in the prison system, whichever would occur later. Importantly, the legislation did not specify the total numbers of transfers to take place. And one other milestone in the history of the program was there was a lawsuit challenging the program after it began regarding the waiver of certain state civil service rules. And in February 2007, a state district court judge did rule that the program was in violation of state law for the applicable civil service rules. However, that decision was overturned in June 2008 by a court of appeal. If you turn to the third page, I'll go into a discussion of the procurement process that the department's used, as well as the current contract that they're operating under. So since the department wasn't required to operate under normal competitive bidding processes, they didn't really have to go through a formal request for proposal or RFP that you may be familiar with. What they did instead was they used an RFI, which is a request for information. And an RFI is a somewhat less formal version of an RFP, which is really designed just to gain, it's more of a market survey just to see what's available in the market, but it doesn't specify exactly what the department's looking for or require that companies provide specific bids. And in the RFIs, and the department has issued a couple of them, it did issue one a couple of months before the program began. They did gather certain information from various vendors that would include the capacity that the vendor had, because the department was looking for particular types of housing for the inmates. The overcrowding situation was more serious with level 2 and level 3 medium to high security inmates, so they really needed facilities that would house those. They also looked at cost, obviously, and where the facilities were located, amongst other variables. And as a result of that process, they selected CCA as the initial vendor, and subsequently amended this contract several times, and I'll talk about that in the next bullet point. The department signed a contract with CCA originally in October 2006, and this contract was for 1,000 prison beds, and the rate was $63 per bed per day. Now, a couple months later, the contract was amended. As I mentioned earlier, there were some issues when the program first began with transferring inmates on an involuntary basis. In addition, the court-appointed federal receiver had some issues with transferring inmates. So the program got off to a slower start than they had anticipated. So the contract was amended in January 2007 to reflect that delay and make some adjustments. In January 2008, CDCR signed a new contract with CCA, and this contract increased significantly up to 7,772 beds. And the rates for these beds ranged from $63 per day to $72 per bed per day. And the $72 rate was really tied to one specific facility that CCA had constructed in Arizona. The rest of the facilities that they were using were going to remain at $63. The contract did have a provision that they would go up to $65 per day in November 2009. However, as I'll mention in a minute, the department had amended the contract again, so they never actually paid the $65 per bed per day rate. Because in January 2008, they amended the contract to add an additional 360 beds, and in 2009, increased capacity to 10,468 beds. Under the current contract, it's effective until June 30th, 2011, and as I mentioned, it specifies that CDCR can house 10,468 inmates out of state. The rate per bed per day ranges from $61. One facility, they were able to get the rate down a little bit. Most of the facilities are still $63 per bed per day, which is the same as the original contract. And then that one facility I mentioned that CCA had constructed, which is $72 per day. As part of the contract, inmates are required to receive programming, as I mentioned earlier. And also the contract does have a provision stating that it's contingent upon funding provided by the legislature in the Annual State Budget Act. So that's sort of a very high-level overview of the contract. There's obviously a lot more provisions in it. But on the last page, I wanted to briefly go over just the budget for the program and staffing associated with it. The governor's 2009-10 budget provides about $230 million. It's all general fund for the support of this particular program. About $204 million is for the actual contract with CCA, and then about $26 million is to support CDCR staff that primarily oversee the program. They go out to the facilities and make sure that the contractor is in compliance with department rules and regulations. And then there's also certain other positions I'll talk about in a minute included in that figure. The governor's budget for 2010-11 is proposing a $50 million augmentation to this program. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned earlier, the department wants to expand the program to about 10,500 beds. In terms of the staffing that's associated with the $26 million in funding that I mentioned, there's about 170 positions, and a little more than half of these are what are considered ratio positions that are driven primarily by the number of inmates. And you would have those positions whether or not the inmates are in state prisons or in private facilities. These are correctional counselors and case analysts that analyze their records. And in addition to that, there's about 70 positions that specifically monitor and oversee the program, as I mentioned earlier. And these positions are for personnel to actually go out to the facilities and conduct oversight. In addition to that, there's 33 other positions that aren't actually budgeted in the program, but that do support the program. And so, for example, they have some healthcare positions, about 11 of them, that work on doing the screenings of inmates, as I mentioned earlier. No inmates with serious medical or mental health conditions are being sent out of state, so those staff perform those functions. And that concludes the overview that I prepared. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you want more specific.
Vice Chair Strickland.
Who sets that ratio? Is it set by the legislature or is it set by the executive branch?
It's done during budget deliberations, so the governor proposes it and then the legislature would agree to it. So those are the approved ratios that the legislature has agreed to in previous budget requests. So it's similar to any budget request where the governor proposes it, the legislature can make modifications, but these would be the ratios.
The number of positions is set by the budget, but it's directly linked to the number of individuals.
So it's for example, it would be one correctional counselor for every several hundred inmates. Is typically how we budget some of those positions.
So is the augment in this year's budget, does that correspond to the additional 2,000?
Correct, for the ratio positions. But then there's separate, the oversight positions that I mentioned are not ratio driven. Those are just the department sort of does an assessment of what's required and then submits a budget request based on that. But it's not directly linked to the number of inmates.
And it's 37 and a half new positions being requested in this budget? Is that right?
73 is the current oversight positions. In the budget request, it is, let's see. And I should also mention that the budget request that the department has will be discussed in the budget subcommittees in the spring, as you know. But they are requesting 37 and a half positions.
And 33 are required to meet the ratio?
I'd have to go through and total them up because I don't see where they broke it out that way in here.
Okay, so just a quick question. There are 37 or so new positions being asked for in the budget, and 33 are required in order to meet the ratio specifications set by us all in the process for the number of CDCR staff administering the program for the prisoners that are serving time out of state. So 33 new people are necessary to administer the program for the 2,000 more prisoners that will be serving their time in other states.
Correct.
Okay.
Assemblymember Hagman.
Thank you. Just I'm trying to work on some of my math over here. I just want to clarify a couple of things. For the prisoners, it's roughly what's roughly costs us 23,000 per year to send them out of state.
Correct. That's on a per capita basis.
Not counting the staff to administer that, which I figured out the average staff cost is 154,000 roughly.
Correct. And there are additional costs related to transportation that the department pays for. And in addition, any serious medical care that's necessary, the department would have to pay for as well.
What's the in-state cost roughly averaged out per inmate?
Well, so the average per inmate is close to around 50,000 per year.
That's what I remember, yeah.
But when we're putting together the budget for CDCR, we use an overcrowded rate, which is about 23,000 per year. And that's just because the prisons are overcrowded at the moment. So it's kind of a marginal
Now,
rate.
I understand we're in a position that we have to do something to comply with some of the federal court orders. And we don't have the space or the proper space here in California to house these folks. And so we're shipping them all out. But at some point, if we were have the, I'm just wondering if you look at apples and oranges and try to make them all apples here. If we have to build the facilities here in California, we put infill beds, we build new facilities, and you amortize that cost over what it should be costing us per inmate here, can you put that in comparison to what we're spending out of state?
If we were to build new prison beds for the inmates, that I wouldn't be able to do that just off the top of my head because you'd have to include all of the construction and debt service costs.
Over a period of time. And
right.
For the
but it would, I mean, something like that would be closer probably to the average.
Okay, well, let me go through another path here, too. Right now, we cost roughly $48,000 per inmate. Again, I'm not sure what the difference with that is versus the overcrowded rate of 23. Basically, so you have a prison that's set for 3,000 beds and you put 5,000 people in there.
Then
it
kind
comes
of
down.
each extra one, you don't need
Correct.
the same.
So really, if we're spending 22,000 per inmate out of state, we're not really saving the difference between 48 and 22. We're just taking that overcapacity out.
Correct. So that's important to realize is that if these inmates were housed in state, we would budget them at 23,000 per year.
So roughly the same price.
Correct.
Even though we still have the federal court order to get them out.
Right. But the purpose of the program is to alleviate the overcrowding, not necessarily to save money.
Correct.
But sort of when you're looking at the numbers, it does work out fairly evenly.
Assemblywoman Lowenthal.
Thank you. I, too, wanted a better understanding of the ratio. When you say on page 3, I think it is it? No, it's page 4. The ratio of staff to inmates. And it seems as though CDCR is paying for the oversight. Of
Correct.
the private prisons, wherever they're located. Do we have the same oversight ratio for our own California prisons?
Not for the positions that are doing oversight. Those are not ratio-driven. The ratio-driven positions are case records analysts. These are positions that look at inmates' files and calculate release dates and stuff like that.
But the cost of those people is not absorbed in the private contract?
No, because it's CDCR staff that still does that particular function of calculating release dates for case records.
And the other question is, let me see if I can find it. Somewhere you mentioned correctional counselors case to oversee the program staffing. Are the services identical in the private prison? I mean,
you mean the rehabilitation services?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I wouldn't say they were identical, and we don't have that much information about the out-of-state programs. The department did tell us that they have education programs, substance abuse programs, and vocational programs, but they weren't able, at least not prior to this hearing, to give me information on the percentage of inmates participating in these programs or how the outcomes compare to in-state programs.
Okay. And again, the criteria for selecting inmates, and maybe this is what Mr. Hagman was asking, since they can be sent now involuntarily, right? And they don't include any level 4.
That's correct.
Our costs, as we look at the cost of prisoners in California, that's all average. That's not, you don't divide that by the level, do you? So we understand the cost of a level 2, the cost of a level 3, the cost of a level 4.
That's correct. We just have sort of an overall average figure that's about $50,000 per year. We don't have a breakout by level that we use. So it is, when you're comparing the cost between the two, this is a very specific population, so you don't necessarily want to compare to that.
Right. I would just say it's very difficult in that case for us to compare, and it was Mr. Hagman who said we need the apples to apples comparison at some point, so we understand the cost of housing more violent prisoners, the cost of housing prisoners with mental illness, the cost of housing sick prisoners, and so on. Thank you.
It would be.
Thank you. Assemblymember Fletcher.
Yeah, I just have a quick question to clarify so I understand properly. So you're saying that the cost to house is $50,000, but then when you get into an overcrowding standpoint, it's $23,000 because they're being overcrowded.
Correct.
So there's not, you're putting people in less space than they would normally be.
Correct.
But we're not supposed to overcrowd. I mean, like at what level is overcrowding okay with the court orders and things?
Well, the latest ruling by the 3-judge panel is being appealed to the Supreme Court currently. Overcrowding, I mean, it creates a lot of problems for the prison system. It creates security problems.
Sure.
It creates problems with inmates getting to their rehabilitation programming.
Sure.
In general, you don't want to have the prisons overcrowded.
You wouldn't want a policy that says we overcrowd on purpose. In general, generally speaking.
Right. I mean, overcrowding is generally
Kind of bad.
But in terms of your question about defining what's overcrowded, that's
Okay. Well, let me ask this just broadly speaking. So out of the total number of inmates in California that we have, picking somebody else's, not your definition of what overcrowding is, but pick somebody else's, and I don't care who, what percentage are in an overcrowding capacity?
Well, if you want to take the 3-judge panel's definition,
right.
they say the prison should only be at 137.5% of capacity, right?
Which just,
so they
and set aside the merits of the issue, it sounds silly to me that we're saying 137% of capacity is logical.
Well, the design capacity is really based on one inmate per cell generally.
Okay.
But I think they recognize that some inmates can be double celled.
Okay. So the 3-judge panel said 137% of capacity. What are we at now?
So we're closer to 200%.
200%. What's the number of inmates between 137
So we have
200?
168,000 inmates, and the 3-judge panel would like to reduce that by about 40,000, so almost a quarter.
So according to them, 40,000. So for those 40,000, but those are calculated. Okay, so the 23,000 number you gave me for overcrowding, is that calculated based on everybody over 100% of capacity or everybody over 137% of capacity?
The way it's calculated is when the department activates a facility, and we haven't activated a new facility in many years, there's sort of a base staffing package that's done. And that's based on the particular facility. They assess the security needs because facilities are designed differently. And that's sort of your base staffing. Now, once you get above that into the overcrowded situation, then it's driven by what we use as a 6-to-1 ratio between, it would be 6 inmates per staff.
Okay.
Is sort of the ratio that's just we've been using for many years now. Most of those 6 positions would be correctional officers, but
right.
it could include others as well. And so the $23,000 marginal cost figure is driven by that 6-to-1 ratio that we use.
Okay. So given that you use that ratio to come to it, I guess what I'm trying to get is when we're looking at the total population and the total budget for CDCR and how it breaks down per inmate, what percentage of the inmates are calculated at 50% or 50,000 a year, and what percentage are calculated at the 23,000 per year?
When we're building the budget?
Yes. For inmates right now.
So the inmate population doesn't fluctuate that much on the natural year to year. So we're using the marginal cost figure because it's small changes up or down. Now there have been, as you know, proposals enacted in the past budget to reduce the population a little bit.
I guess my
more,
question is, out of the 167,000, how many of those are calculated at the marginal overcrowding cost, and how many are calculated at the full inmate cost?
You use the federal number, for example. Here's the three-judge panel you mentioned. They picked this number.
Because at some point,
Well,
like, you get money from the state and you have a budget and it
Yeah.
allocates how it's spent. So that's what I'm trying to ascertain.
See, the way that it works is the CDCR kind of has a base budget, right?
Right.
And then every year they're projecting differences in the inmate population.
Okay.
So those differences, since they're rather small and we know that they're overcrowded, use the overcrowding rate.
For how many of the inmates do they use the overcrowding rate? That's my
Well,
question.
but because the budget isn't built that way, because you're not every year we're not literally rebuilding the whole budget for CDCR. We're just doing incremental changes.
Right.
So we're only looking at the margin.
Okay, so
time we
within the
build it.
margin, how many of them?
Well, all of the ones that.
All of the ones. That's what I mean. What is all of the ones? How many is all of the ones?
Well,
Do you understand? You understand what I'm
yeah,
asking? I'm not trying to be.
No,
I'm just trying to get a sense. You got 167,000 inmates.
Right.
You calculate some of them at 50,000 a year and some of them at 23,000 a year, and I'm just trying to figure out at what point. Like, how do you come to those? I understand how you come to that number, but how does that number break down to the inmates that you actually have?
We don't have a number that you're asking for, but I can give you an estimate. I mean, if something like what the three-judge panel
I'm sorry,
wanted.
hang on one second before you go to the three-judge panel. If you don't have a number that we're asking for, then how the heck did you get to 23,000 and 50,000 if you don't know how they break down in terms of the budget?
Well, as I was explaining, we don't sort of rebuild the budget every year for each institution for the whole department.
Right.
So, say right now we have 168,000 inmates. Say
Right.
the department they have a population projection. Say they project it's going to increase to 169,000.
Right.
A 1,000 inmate increase. When we do the budget, they would calculate how much it costs for that additional 1,000, right? And
On what formula? On 50,000 a year or
on
23,000?
the marginal cost.
On the marginal cost. Okay. So at some point we've acknowledged every new prisoner we add is at 23,000.
Correct.
Correct? Okay.
And so for the question you're asking, to sort of get to the average cost figure, you'd have to probably get to a number where all of the temporary beds are gone and a certain level of overcrowding in the system too. And I just don't have an exact.
So and I'm wrapping up, Mr. Chairman, but if we know that every new prisoner we add is at the marginal cost of 23,000, so that tells me at some point we made a decision that every new prisoner that is added, according to your statement, every new prisoner that's added is at the $23,000 mark. So let's just back up in time. And at what point in growth of prison population did we start using that figure?
I don't know the answer to that.
There had to be some point because we do it now.
Right.
So if you had to guess, best estimate out of 167,000 inmates, how many of them are calculated at the overcrowding rate and how many of them are calculated at the regular rate?
A best guess, I would say, somewhere in the order of 30, 40,000 maybe would be on the marginal. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Assemblymember Emerson.
I'm curious about the CDCR staffing. Are any of these staff members out of state at these facilities?
Correct. They do travel out of state periodically to go to the facilities, but none of them are actually stationed out of state. They travel back and forth from California to the facilities on a rotational basis.
But are they there on a regular basis? Do they stay for a period of time, or how does that work?
I think it varies by facility, and the department can probably explain it a little better. But I believe they go out for maybe a week or 10 days, and then they come back because they live in California for maybe a week. And
so we have not moved any staff
No.
out of state. All right, thank you.
I think we'll clarify with CDCR about whether there are permanent staff, particularly in Mississippi, which in the materials that we have state that there are staff there on a regular basis. Assemblyman Arambula.
Let me describe what I think is the issue. the issue is not should we be placing prisoners out of state, because I think the answer is we're overcrowded. We have to find a way, and this was a way that the governor proposed several years ago to accommodate some of the excess population. So that's done. Until we get our act together within state to accommodate that population, this seems to be an option, a tool to deal with the overcrowding. The question, the issue to me is, are we getting the best deal possible in our contracts for placement out of state? And I can understand to some extent that there was a need to declare an emergency and to act quickly. But we did so, I say we collectively, the administration did so, ratified to some extent by the legislature. We did so using a fairly uncommon bidding practice. Because, I suppose, because of the extenuating circumstances, the need to act quickly and so on. Today, are we at the point where we should go back to the more traditional bidding practices where you do an RFP, you look at the bids, you get to go through some public process, you compare, there's competition, so we're not dealing with just one company. Are we at the point where you would recommend, where the LAO would recommend, that if we are to continue this placement of out-of-state inmates, that we do so using more traditional bidding practices?
Well, I think in general we do agree. I mean, competitive bidding process is probably the way that you're going to get the best price and provide a degree of, I think, transparency for everyone involved. And your point does make sense. While there are certain situations where waiving competitive bidding would make sense, for example, an emergency, it is a little over 3 years later. So, and as I mentioned, the department's proposing to expand the program even more. So moving forward, that would be one issue for the legislature to consider. Now, the governor, as I mentioned, did, through his executive authority, waive the applicable state contract laws, but he did that according to the Emergency Services Act, which is a statute written by the legislature.
Okay. It seems to me that a competitive bidding process would be best for all concerned. Is it not a fact that we currently are contracting with one entity?
Correct.
And the price that we're paying to that entity varies depending on the states that the inmates are placed at.
There's one facility that's a little bit higher in Arizona than the others.
And that one facility in Arizona, does it not have the majority of inmates placed out of state?
It doesn't have the majority, but it has the most. So it has, under the latest contract, about 3,000, which is the highest, but not the majority.
And that price is
$72.38
compared to 61 or 63
at the other facilities. Correct.
Are there other states that may have excess capacity in their state prisons that we could contract and possibly, work with them to use that excess space?
The only one that I'm aware of is I know Michigan had excess capacity, and I know CDCR was in talks with the state of Michigan, but ultimately did not decide to contract with them.
Okay. The lawsuit that you mentioned that was brought challenging the practice, lost at the trial court, overturned at the appellate court. Is that are there no other appeals? Is that now a final
I think the Supreme
binding
Court
decision?
Yeah, the Supreme Court declined to hear it.
Okay.
So
Okay. Do we have any kind of performance evaluation done for the outcomes for these inmates placed out of state? In other words, do we look at their recidivism rate? Do we look at their completion of vocational training, things like that?
I know the department does track some of the program completion data. I'm not sure about the recidivism rates.
So it tracks. Is there a reporting requirement that they provide that information to the legislature?
No, not that information, no.
Well, I think you've covered most of the areas that I had questions about. I would reserve some questions for the department when they come. But, Mr. Chair, I think one of the takeaways from today's hearing, I hope, is that we will consider the need for emergency action and that we will require that there be more traditional bidding practices so it's out in the open. I don't think it's a matter of do we have a choice of sending folks out of state or not. It's a matter of under what circumstances. And I think after 3 years, we shouldn't be able to hide behind it's an emergency. It's not a shock. I mean, it's been here big as life for all the time I've been up here. So,
Thank you. Assemblymember Block.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The difference between the highest priced beds per day, $73, 72 something, and 61 or 63, have you analyzed the reasons for that difference? It strikes me we're sending most of our prisoners to the high price rooms instead of the low price rooms.
Yeah, I don't know the exact reason. You could ask the department. I do know that one facility, the company actually had to build, so it could have something to do with that. The other facilities were already in existence.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if that was the reason.
Thanks.
Okay, I have a couple of Assemblymember Jones.
Thank you. What's the legal basis for using an RFI process instead of a competitive bidding process in this context?
Well, the governor had waived all of the applicable state contracting laws through his emergency proclamation, so the department really could have used whatever process they wanted. They could have used a competitive process, but they chose not to because the governor had waived it.
And that emergency declaration has been enforced since when?
October 2006.
Okay, and I think there's some recent case law for the proposition that an emergency can't run forever.
That was related to the furloughs, correct?
Yeah. So, it just strikes me that we're well past the time at which it would be justifiable to use a non-competitive bidding process. And I hope in whatever recommendation we send forward that we also consider legislation constraining the governor's emergency powers in these contexts, because it seems to me that there's been a flagrant abuse of the normal competitive bidding process under the cloak of an emergency that, frankly, as one of my colleagues pointed out, happened some time ago and now really is sort of the status quo. So I hope that in addition to recommending that you use the competitive bidding process and forwarding those recommendations to the appropriate policy committees, that we also consider recommending legislation that would constrain the emergency power in a circumstance like this, because it just seems to me outrageous that we're not using the normal competitive bidding process here. Thanks.
Thank you. I had a couple of follow-up questions. One is on the contracts, just contracts themselves. October 2006, the first contract for 1,000 beds. January 2008, there were 2 contracts let, one at 7,700 beds and then another one that added another 360 beds. But for all intents and purposes, that's one action. It happened in the same month. And then the third one was October 2009, where they expanded up to 10,400 beds, right? So right. Those are the 3 step-ups that happened in the contract. So we went from 1,000 beds to 10,400 beds with a couple of RFIs, market surveys, I think you called them, which I think is entirely accurate. I've seen the data that was submitted by the prospective vendors, and that's all you can call it. I would call it a price sheet at best. So clearly not geared toward anything where you could see that they were comparing apples to apples. In these contracts, you've mentioned transportation is not part of it, not part of the expense that's covered. Staffing levels for CDCR to go inspect is not included. What else is not included in the contract?
Another one would be certain medical care expenses. So as I mentioned, most of the inmates that are transferred out of state are screened for serious medical or mental health issues. And the contract does cover medical care and health care provided at the facility. But if for some reason an inmate has to go to an outside hospital for urgent care, it only covers up to, I believe, $2,500 of care. And then anything beyond that, the company bills the department for.
And who decides whether to send them outside?
I believe it would be. I'm not sure the answer to that. I'm not sure if it's the company or if it's some of the CDR.
Wouldn't it
staff
seem
on
that
site,
it would be advantageous to ship off everybody who gets sick?
There is a provision.
If you had that provision?
Yeah, there is a provision in the contract that does say that if the care could have been provided within the facility, then CDCR won't pay for it. So I think if the department can prove that they had sent the inmate out unnecessarily, then they would not necessarily have to pay for it. But I don't know if that's ever been tested.
Okay. Anything else beyond the medical, mental?
The transportation, the oversight staff, I think those would be the biggest three.
Okay. And then following up on Vice Chair Strickland's question in terms of the staffing levels that are proposed in the BCR. It seems these aren't new prisoners, right? They're not just walking in and then somebody says, hey, why don't we send these guys
No, they're
out of state?
existing inmates being transferred.
Okay. So if they're in the system currently, then all of those ratios that you were talking about apply to them currently.
Right. Actually, when they put together, it's not included just in this particular one proposal, but they have an offset in the entire budget for CDCR that accounts for. They try to estimate what we would have spent on these inmates if they were in state facilities, and then subtract that out.
So it nets out.
Correct.
It's supposed to net.
But it's going to be a net gain because they are requiring the additional oversight staff and
But in terms of these particular positions that are attached to them going out of state, somebody is already assigned. They already have a I would call them a caseworker. They already have a caseworker in the system.
Right. I think actually looking through the proposal, I might have answered your question incorrectly. I don't think this includes the ratio positions. I think this is all the oversight and the non-ratio positions that they wanted. You had asked earlier if the new staff that they were asking for included ratio, and I don't think it does.
In your memo on page 4, it says the program includes about 170 positions, including 97 caseload-driven positions.
Right, that's the existing.
Okay. And then 73. Okay.
I was just referring to the new.
The current status. Okay. Yeah. So here's my concern with the BCR. If they currently have the staff that is monitoring these prisoners wherever they are, and then they're being shipped off out of state, well, you just shift the person, or you compile all of that additional caseload under the folks who you currently have until you get up to those ratios within the current system, so that it does net out, so that you wouldn't need a new position for these things. So that's where I'm going with this. Is they're currently in the system, they're just changing where they are in the system. You don't need new positions for that.
Yeah, and they do in the budget try to net out those costs. What the augmentation is for the new sort of oversight staff that are required.
And then getting to the oversight staff, we have a full service contract, except for the things we just identified. there are only 5 locations where these prisoners are going. That doesn't change. Regardless of how many prisoners there are in those places, there are only 5 places they're going to. So the oversight team that bounces around from Mississippi to Oklahoma to Arizona is the same team. And the oversight is the same. And so I don't see why you need new bodies to go to the same places and check the same facilities for those prisoners. Now, is there some rationale that I'm missing here?
No, it's a logical question. I mean, they do with the budget request have a justification for the positions that they're asking for. And as I mentioned, we will be discussing this in budget subcommittee in the
Which
spring.
3 of us are on.
Yeah.
So we will see this again.
Correct. We're still reviewing the department's entire budget and haven't sort of come to a recommendation on this particular proposal yet.
Okay. Thank you very much. If there are no other questions.
Okay, so just for clarification, the 37 and a half new positions that are being requested will not go to any type of case management whatsoever.
They do have a couple in here that are labeled correctional counselor and case records, but I don't think they're the typical. I don't think they are the ratio positions.
Mr. Chair, is it possible that these questions are better directed to CDCR in clarification?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll wait to do that then.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. We will, while we're bringing up CDCR, we do have in the members' packets sections A, B, C, D, and E. These are the recommendations for the last, for the fall items. There was some lack of clarity as to whether we could take action on the things that we did in the fall because we were out of session. So we're going to do them all in a lump sum. Section A, tab A, July 1st hearing. This one we just didn't have a quorum at the time. This is on reimbursement recovery items. Essentially, 2 of the items we've moved ahead with. Thank you. Let's call the roll. Forgot we didn't do that too.
De la Torre,
Here.
Strickland, Arambula, Berryhill, Block, Buchanan, Caballero, Emerson, Fletcher, Fuentes, Hagman, Huber, Jeffries, Jones,
Here.
Lowenthal, Perez, Valines.
Thank you. Okay. So tab A is July 1st. The first 2 recommendations to establish a centralized collection system and an evaluation of the community service option. There is a working group that is working on doing this that is supposed to report back by the end of this year. So they are already on this path. And one of the things they're looking at is the community service, which is already currently done by DMV folks who have vehicle problems. They could do community service in lieu of payment. The last recommendation here, this is to require that initiatives require a language that says that any misspent funds as verified by an independent audit would have to be recovered from the entity responsible for the misspent funds. That recommendation has already been sent over to the Assembly and Senate Select Committee on Improving State Government, which is doing a bunch of government reform work. B, September 23rd. Both of these items relating to the Lottery Commission have already essentially been done. On October 25th, 2009, just after our hearing, 9 players were allowed to play the game that they should have played in the first place in the lottery, and we are happy to report that they won an additional $264,000 in prizes that they otherwise would have had access to back in, I don't know, January, February, when they were originally scheduled to be on that show. The second one is regarding the inquiry to the Attorney General. We've referred this to the Senate GO Committee, which is the hearing where the statement was made, and we figured it didn't happen in front of us, so we figured they were the appropriate committee to hear the outcome of that. C, October 28th. This is regarding Administrative Office of the Courts. The top recommendations, 1, 2, 3, 4, actually all of these recommendations regarding the transparency. We have been told that the AOC is preparing these materials in this format for the budget subcommittee, and we should get that by the end of February. There were additional issues related to this hearing, and I think Assemblymember Lowenthal wanted to report on that.
Well, some of it actually, Mr. Chair, is mentioned in the bullet requiring the next annual report related to the CCMS project.
Yeah.
But to that end, I have also requested an audit from JLAC on the CCMS project.
Okay. Assemblymember Jones?
On that one, I have a slightly different recommendation to propose, and that is that in addition to supporting the request for an audit, that we actually recommend that the budget subcommittee zero out expansion funding for the CCMS project, given that the court's budget crisis is such that they're now having to close courthouse doors a couple times a month. It seems to me that the choice of expanding this project, which is a worthwhile project in good times, but not a priority in bad times, that the choice of putting money into that versus keeping the courthouse doors open, we ought to be putting money into keeping the courthouse doors open. And it turns out that the dollar amount is about the same. The line item request for continued expansion of this item is the same amount as the savings that the courts are getting from closing their courthouse doors once or twice a month. So I'd recommend that our recommendation be to the Budget Committee that they actually not appropriate funds for this project, instead put the money into keeping courthouse doors open.
That's a major amendment. Any discussion about that?
I don't know how the chair wants to proceed. Whether he's going to take A, B, C individually or as a group, or do this one separately, or whatever the chair would like to do. But that would,
I don't know if under the chair's whatever your. I don't know what my.
It's the will of the committee.
Right. No, I mean, in terms of your prerogative, I think that there are a lot of outstanding issues with the AOC, and I think we just really scratched the surface, especially as it relates to how and what they fund, and a lot of the recommendations get to that. But what about the lawyers that are funded by the AOC to handle the caseload of foster children, and how underfunded those are, as we talk about additional expenses that are paid for by perhaps the Judicial Council or the AOC as it relates to additional security for judges and those kind of things that we didn't even talk about. I think that there is an awful lot of oversight and transparency that is lacking, and some of our recommendations get to that, but perhaps even there's an opportunity for a further hearing down the road to have an open forum about some of the additional concerns that we have, especially as it relates to that. CCMS and others, I don't think that was by any means resolved in any of us feeling comfortable with that process. Yeah. And the openness of that process. So I think there's an awful lot still to discuss about the AOC, and I very much appreciate the ones that are outlined here. I think that's just the start, though.
Okay. Well, these recommendations, as I recall, we gave the AOC until February to have plenty of time for the budget subcommittee to be able to digest the information and incorporate it into those discussions in the spring. And so this could be part of that very easily. Assemblymember Emerson?
Are you looking for a motion on these at this time?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
This whole package is on bonk.
I so move.
Okay.
Second.
Including the CCMS?
Well, I thought my motion would be for what we have here.
Okay.
And since we've asked them to come back at the February meeting, would have time to make that recommendation of Mr. Jones at the time to go to the budget. So I would just move the ones we have here at this point.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Yes, Assemblymember Arambula. Mr. Chair.
I would. I will support the motion. I do understand the desire to keep our courts open. I would point out, though, that decision to close the courts was one made by the courts themselves. I don't think they wish to continue that practice, and I think the issues that we discussed are encapsulated in the recommendations, whereas getting into transfers and the appropriateness of transferring monies from one area to the other is best left to the budget subcommittee. So I understand the motive behind the comments made by Member Jones, and I think the committee will certainly endeavor to keep faith with that thought. But for today's for this committee's purposes, I think the motion is appropriate, and I'll support it.
Okay, thank you. And out of due deference to the chair of the subcommittee, I think we will go ahead and vote on these items as en bloc, as laid out in the document in front of us. Call the roll.
De la Torre.
Aye.
Strickland. Arambula. Berryhill.
Aye.
Block. Buchanan. Caballero. Emerson. Fletcher. Fuentes. Hagman. Huber. Jeffries. Jones.
Aye.
Lowenthal. Perez. Valines.
Okay. Tab D, November 18th. This is regarding information technology projects. The recommendations are to adopt the template of questions that would be a basis of information for the legislature to look at IT projects, that the LAO or budget staff maintain records for the duration of the project so that we can see what the past efforts are, what the costs are, the time frames, etc. And then finally, that upon completion of the testing and implementation of these projects, the books be archived so future projects can draw on that information. We have a motion. Second. Call the roll.
De la Torre.
Aye.
Strickland. Arambula. Berryhill. Block. Buchanan. Caballero. Emerson. Fletcher. Fuentes. Hagman. Huber. Jeffries. Jones. Lowenthal. Perez. Valines.
Finally, December 9th, regarding the ARA funds, the federal stimulus funding, this information was prepared with input from committee members. There was a letter that was sent around. We packaged that. We already went ahead and sent it to the committee, so there's no action needed. When we get that back, we will make sure everybody on the committee gets that information, and then if we need to take next steps at that point, we will do so. Thank you very much for catching up on those. Now we have Scott Kernan, Undersecretary, Adult Operations, Department of Corrections.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. Thank
Go
you
ahead,
for
Scott.
having the department here today. I'll just make a brief comment regarding listening to the hearing, and that I think was lost maybe in the context of the LAO's presentation. The out-of-state program has, at the height of the overcrowding situation, we're at over right around 20,000 beds. Those are inmates that are sleeping in gyms, day rooms, closets. We had a 3-judge panel looming. We had a receiver's office that was certainly concerned and cited the overcrowding situation as the reason to go out of state. This legislature and the governor gave us the authority to go through a process to find not only the cheapest bed, but to find the right bed. We went nationwide surveys using an RFI process that was mentioned. We sent it to all 50 Department of Corrections in the nation. We sent it to all the private facilities, and we solicited input not only on costs, but on the type of construction, the type of perimeter, the medical facilities, the proximity to a hospital, the programming that would be provided, a whole litany of items that the department could evaluate from an operations perspective. The out-of-state program has allowed us to reduce in half the amount of bad beds that we had in the department at that time. The cost, the marginal rate, and the discussion about the marginal rate, I thought that the number was closer. The design bed capacity, you could argue 85,000. So that means that we've been given the marginal rate for everything above 85,000, and I'll let the budget people argue over the details. But the fact of the matter is the cost per inmate for our out-of-state program is at least approximates what we pay on the marginal rate. And the Bureau of State Audits did a report that suggested it was $3,000 cheaper to house an inmate out of state than it is to house them in state, and $7,000 if you count the administrative costs. I heard a lot about the ability to go through a formal RFP process. The department has had to act quickly to address the overcrowding situation.
Excuse me, Assemblymember Valines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure I heard you right. We were just assuming the number that you would do the marginal cost was above the 3-judge panel's decision, but you're saying it's anything over 85K.
I guess I was trying to respond to the number, and the LAO was very diligently trying to answer it. But if design bed capacity, our prisons were all built for 2 people in a cell, all of them. But what we did as a legislature and a government is we built the program space for 100%. We immediately overcrowded to 190%. So we got the base staffing for the design bed capacity of that prison. So anything above the 2 men to the cells was what we paid on the marginal rate. And the LAO is right. It's been built over many budget cycles, and so it doesn't fluctuate much from year to year.
Okay, let me just so I can understand again. So the 85,000 is really the 2-person per cell number that you were alluding to, and then anything over that, when we go into gym space, even if it was designed to appropriately cover overcrowding, that's where you get the marginal cost.
And I just was not prepared. I think it might be a little higher number than 80,000.
But it's not the 100. It's not 130 or something. Okay. All right. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Because that's where I was just trying to get clarity. Like when we look at the numbers, what do they mean and where they come from, so we can kind of compare out of state versus in state. So just so I understand, so roughly 85,000 would be accounted for at the traditional cost of 50,000 a year, roughly.
Yes, sir.
And the remaining would be calculated at roughly the transitional cost of 23,000 per year. Okay. Thank you. That was all I wanted.
Thank you.
And I'll conclude, sir, by the discussion about the RFP process and having a formal procurement. To go out for a formal procurement, it takes 7 to 9 months. The department, through many iterations, for example, this latest expansion that we're going through, we have I think, I'm very proud of the staff and out of state that we got to that 8,000 level and reduced that overcrowding. But to get from 8,000 to the 10,400 that we discussed, if we went through a formal RFP process, we wouldn't be able to do that until next year, very likely. It'll take 7 to 9 months to go through that formal process. And with the 3-judge panel looming on us and still overcrowding conditions, in Assemblyman Hagman's area, I lost a prison not too long ago. CIM West had a very serious riot. We lost the entire facility, and largely because of overcrowding. I don't think anybody can dispute that our prisons have been a tinderbox. If the legislature required us to go through a formal process and did not give us the ability to make fast decisions to move inmates, which I think will stand the public scrutiny any day of not only cost, but the type of programming and the security of the facility we need, then we're making a mistake. This department needs the ability to make those moves fast and not go through a formal process and pick the best product at the cheapest price that fits for our inmates. And with that, I'd like to answer any questions that you have.
Okay. Assemblymember Arambola.
when we did the RFI, did we ask about cost?
Yes, sir.
That's not what my notes reflect.
I can go through a great detail of all of the factors that we go through in our analysis to make sure that we're getting the best product.
On members on tab 4, you on page 2 and 3, you have some of the you have little grids, little charts that have some of the things that came back on these RFIs, just to give you a sense of what came back through that process.
My notes reflect that we asked about a number of things, but we did not seek information about costs.
That's not correct, sir. We in every one of our RFIs, and we've did 4 of them so far, we've asked a litany, and I won't bore you with all of them, but we've included all the costs. Again, proximity to hospitals, physical plant. We've sent staff nationwide looking at other departments, prisons, including the private facilities, to make sure that they meet our standards, so that we don't lose an inmate out there. But it absolutely, sir, did include costs.
In the end, we only had one bidder.
Let me explain how.
One response.
That's not true, really. When we went out for our original response, we actually awarded to another private company. And that private company, because of the sunset date that's been mentioned, because of, really a lawsuit that was mentioned, the receiver's delay, there's been a number of things mentioned here today that had caused that vendor to have to decide if they were going to go with another customer. So that other vendor ended up dropping out. The reason, and we've always been cognizant of having just one vendor, and quite frankly, in the most recent RFP that we're going through, there's a number of promising other vendors. But this is what CCA did. CCA had inventory, they had the right inventory, and they came at the right price.
Okay. Now, I don't want to belabor what happened in the past.
Okay.
That's done. Going forward, though, this contract with CCA, as I understand, will expire sometime in July of 2011.
Unless the sunset date is lifted, yes, sir.
Okay. And in exchange for lifting that sunset date, does the department have a position on going through a competitive bidding process this time around, given that, as you say, 7 to 9 months is a typical procurement process? Are we now in a situation that is not an emergency, and can we go through the bidding process that is normally used?
And what I would say to you, sir, is that, as the LAO mentioned, we're still at 200% overcrowding. The 3-judge panel, and there was some discussion about their latest ruling, but if the Supreme Court rules that we must reduce our population to 137, what that would mean is we'd have to let inmates out. So our ability to...
With all due respect, the Supreme Court is not likely to make a decision until fall of next year.
Right.
Which is beyond 7 to 9 months.
And that's but the department is put forth a number of proposals to try to reduce that population, and I know you've been, very involved in that process. But I guess what that goes to is the critical nature of fastly moving to get beds. If we go through a formal process, if we did that right now, sir, it would take us 9 months to get through that formal process. I have overcrowding in California right now. So the governor's emergency proclamation is attempting to try to stay ahead of it. It is my hope that other vendors become involved in this process in this latest RFP. But the information that we're getting and the department has to make those decisions is significant, that I think maybe even is better than an RFP process in a lot of ways. Operationally, you can't compare a prison that has dorm beds to a prison that has cells and a fence that has an electronic monitoring system on it. And that's what a lot of the complications become as we went through this process.
Now, my understanding of the bidding process is that the RFI process is typically done to determine who is qualified to bid. And I'm struggling. I mean, it seems to defy common sense that we can have an emergency continue year after year, and yet we're not able to. I mean, an emergency to me is something that happens, you have to respond to it immediately. Do we not have time now to employ a more typical, customary bidding process?
Sir,
We're
I think
talking about hundreds of millions of dollars.
So I think how I would respond to that, and I know of your involvement in AB 900, we have not been able to construct any capacity in state. For a variety of reasons, including the economic situation that we have and lawsuits. So we have no additional capacity. The out-of-state program was always designed to provide us that immediate capacity while we tried to build in-state and get infill beds that was mentioned earlier, so that we could take care of our own population in California. So I think what I would suggest to you is that a formal process simply will be very difficult to meet the mandates of our current overcrowding situation and go through a formal procurement with all the variables that go on from prison to prison and state to state.
Well, in the spirit of candor, I will say that I will find it difficult to vote to continue the contract if we don't use an RFP process, because I think it's incumbent on us to watch every dollar carefully. And it seems to me that the CDCR has grown accustomed to operating outside of the traditional rules. And I just find it very difficult that we cannot go through a more traditional competitive bidding process. I think we get a better price, and I think we get better service with that process. In any event, things are out in the open, and we can compare from one company to another. Right now, it looks like a sweetheart deal, to be honest with you, and there's no really control on the costs. For example, CCA uses its own transportation company and passes the cost on to us. Aren't there some ways that we can shave some money? For $10 million, we can do a heck of a lot of good for people that really need the help. Why wouldn't we do everything possible to try to squeeze this cost down as much as possible?
I don't want to sit here and be an advocate for a particular private company. CCA, the cost of transporting inmates, and it's a large reason why we picked Arizona for one of our facilities to defer some transportation costs and get them close to their families. But the reality of it is that they're paying us in the discussions in the costs. We're getting $63 a day, negotiated down to $61 with this latest extension.
Except for Arizona, which is $73.
Right, and every other person that responded to the RFI was considerably higher than that. Another company participated, offered some Arizona beds, and they were at 74. CCA in the Oklahoma has paid for transportation costs. They negotiated in this latest extension to go from $63 to $61 for the entire facility. So this vendor has been markedly patient with us as we've added staffing to them mandated by the receiver's office, and have continued to work with us in that capacity. And it's my hope that as these other vendors, as we go through other procurements, that we'll be able to do the same thing with these other vendors. But it has been competitive, and I have those costs. And so if we could provide your office with the RFI responses, including the per diems, and then discuss the actual physical plan, I think that you will see that it has been a reasonable, competitive process.
Well, once again, Mr. Chairman, I don't wish to rehash what has happened in the past, but I think going forward, we do have an obligation to take a look at it with an eye towards controlling some costs, or at least looking to see where we can get the best possible deal for our citizens.
Thank you. And I think Assemblymember Valines had some questions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I just want to say I appreciate your testimony and your candor and being direct. It's not been my experience with the agency at all. I mean, so I just want to share it. I'm surprised, and I appreciate it. I've known Mr. Rambula for a long time. I've served with him for 5 years, and I was on his budget subcommittee that oversaw this. I would say that when I hear him say that, I forget the word now, but when he basically says he doesn't want to argue and that he'd have a hard time supporting something, that's as close as he gets to cursing. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think what he was getting at makes a lot of sense, and I just want to rehash it in words that maybe I can understand. This has been an ongoing emergency. It's not going to change. You're going to be dealing with it for a long time, but it's been now 3 years or whatever it's been. Ought you not start an RFP process and do it as you're doing the work you're doing? Because you're only taking out about, 100 and something a month out of the population and moving into the private facilities?
Approximately now. We can't get as many as 400 out.
So I would think somewhere there's a way to find, a compromise, for lack of a better term, that says, we're continuing the RFI, but we're starting an RFP for future. You're going to be in this position. We have to dump 30,000 people. So why wouldn't you start the RFP process now? Let it be public, because I've gone through some paperwork and seen that I do think you probably had the best deal that you could get. I mean, like, for example, wasn't Michigan, when the state of Michigan said they were going to balance their budget off our inmates, weren't their cost was significantly higher, correct?
Yes, sir.
What was their number?
I don't recall exactly. I could find that for you, but it was considerably higher.
Right. So you probably have gotten, the best cost that you can, or at least on paper, but an RFP would make it public, like has been talked about, would help everybody sharpen their pencils and squeeze costs, because they're going to have to really go for it. I mean, the RFI, I understand, but I think that was for the first year, and we can still work under that. But if I was the agency secretary, I would call Mr. Rambula and say, here's our RFP that we're putting out on the street tomorrow. We'd like you to look at this, get your thoughts, give it to the chairman and the vice chair, and put it on the street in the next week, and then I think you'd be in good shape. I really don't think you want to continue down this road just hearing the committee today, because basically you're going to be putting yourself in a position of dealing with the crisis of early release and the legislature frustrated that it's not an open, transparent process. That's what I would do.
Just to paraphrase, we don't write blank checks. And it's been 4 years now. And the first time, completely understandable. An emergency was declared. You moved down that road. But now you've gone back to that well a couple of times. And we're not seeing on our end that the process was followed in a proper way. Assemblywoman Strickland, Vice Chair Strickland.
Can you provide some clarification on the need for 37 and a half new positions?
Yes. The discussion about ratio positions, the correctional counselors, case records people that are supporting our inmates in state right now, when we transfer them in state, we take down those positions. To respond to the chair's question, the 37 positions are to provide regular oversight of the facilities and to support the inmate population. When we developed the out-of-state program, we were very clear that we were going to have a direct and constant engagement with the vendor to ensure that they were meeting all the mandates of California and making sure that our inmates are receiving what they have coming. For example, when we do classification of an inmate annually to review where they're at and see that they're at the appropriate level of security, my staff do that from COSEF in conjunction with the privates. When an inmate gets a disciplinary infraction and is put in ADSEG, my staff do those hearings just like they do in California to ensure that the inmate's due process rights are met. So those staff are supportive of that. The vendors, for profit, I think the state is required to go into those facilities and make sure, respond to critical incidents that occur, go in and make sure that they're not cutting corners on costs, making sure that there's agreed upon staffing is actually being hired. All of those things.
Any of that. I think, though, that the chairman made an excellent point that we're not increasing the number of facilities under supervision. We're merely increasing the number of inmates that are under supervision, and why necessarily that would constitute a need for 37 and a half new positions seems unclear.
Let me respond to that. So if you have a prison that you add 1,000 inmates in state, so now you got to do more appeals. The inmate, 1,000 more inmates, you got 1,000 more people appealing. You got that many more disciplinary reports. So while it seems logical that, hey, you're at one location, the work that goes on is really tied to the amount of inmates that you got, not just because they're in one location. Now, there's some economies of scale for sure, but administrative support in our prisons, the counselors, and would be for a 5,000 prison would be several hundred people would be assigned to this. The out-of-state program, when we developed it, and you know, in tough economic times, we increased all the ratios. So a counselor in California has a caseload of 161 to 1, I believe it is. In out-of-state, it's 250 to 1. So we didn't skimp. I mean, we did not throw the same level of staffing at out-of-state as we did in-state. We, in fact, were very prudent and put just the amount of staff that we believe are necessary to provide the operational oversight of those facilities.
But with 2,000 new inmates leaving the state at 33 and a half positions or 33 positions, that's a 61 to 1 ratio, not 250 to 1.
That's all the staff, though. So
how many staff of the new 37 and a half are dedicated to that ratio that you're speaking of, the 250 to 1?
I believe there's 33 ratio positions, and
that's 61 to 1. That's not 250 to 1, though.
But it's not just the counselors. It's the case records people. It's the whole staffing package that are supporting that population. It's just not just the counselors at the number you described.
So all of those positions are included in the ratio positions?
Yes. I can give you a detailed listing of the positions that we're getting and the specific ratios that we're getting, and those over and above that ratio that we believe we need for the monitoring component that have been mentioned. And I could provide the justifications and all of that details to your office.
Where are those additional 4 positions then? If your BCR is requesting 37 and a half and you say that there are only 33 and a half required to meet the ratio, where do those additional 4 people do?
I'm probably not describing myself. I believe that there's 33 ratio positions and 17 non-ratio positions that have been asked for in the BCP. So whatever that totals to. I believe that's total. 33 are ratio positions, and the rest are those additional oversight positions I requested. And that does include positions for the medical receiver to do the screening of the inmates, and they also provide oversight of the facilities to make sure that the provisions of the receivership are being met at those out-of-state facilities.
Okay. How many teams monitor the 5 facilities?
It varies. I'm not sure that I know that answer.
You had mentioned that you have teams that go out and spend some time at each of the different facilities and evaluate them to make sure they're not cutting corners, they have appropriate staff ratios and all those kind of things. And so I was under the understanding that they stay for 5 days when they go out, twice a month. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it depends on how far away the facility is. For Mississippi, the furthest facility, I believe it's 9-day rotations, if I'm correct. So they go out there for 9 days, and they're at the facility, and they rotate. In the prisons in Oklahoma, which is a little bit closer, I think it's 5, and in Arizona, I believe it's 5.
And they visit twice a month, these teams?
I can find exactly. It's around twice a month, and but for 5 days.
I mean, if 1/3 of the month is spent overseeing these contracts, I mean, it seems to me that we are laying off teachers. We are talking about releasing 40,000 prisoners back onto the streets of our towns that CDCR could find a way to streamline. And if you have 4 or 5 different teams that have to visit these facilities 1/3 out of the month because they are not able to meet the terms of their contract, is that what's been evidenced, that there's been, incredible problems? That's why you have the constant monitoring? I don't understand, I guess, why the additional allocation of staff, why the additional, $50 million budget request. I mean, I don't think anyone. I want you to have all the tools you need to do your job, and I don't take your positions lightly. I've had an opportunity to go through prisons, and it's not a job I want. It is a tough job, and it's one that requires training and I think appropriate compensation. My concern is that if there are opportunities for us to find savings through streamlining the bureaucracy of CDCR, that's not the men and women on the ground in the prisons, but if there are opportunities to find those savings in also our out-of-state placements, then we need to be doing that we need to not be searching for additional budget augmentations for bureaucratic positions to monitor a few thousand more prisoners. that's just my concern, and maybe you can speak to that.
Well, I think your concerns are very fair, and I think that from an operational perspective, having the Department of Corrections in those facilities to make sure that, either responding to critical incidents or just making sure that the inmates are getting to their medical care, getting appropriately fed, or getting to the programs is a very important function for the Department of Corrections, and to make sure that our inmates are getting cared for. And I think that the level of staffing that we're providing out there is not extravagant. I think it's a reasonable amount that had been previously, through the budget change process, approved by the legislature. So, happy to go through and go position by position and explain in great detail what they do, but just from my perspective operationally, looking at the conditions of the prisons and the layoffs and the terrible situations we're going through, it does not appear to be an extravagant level of staffing for what will amount to 10,500 inmates out of state.
So for every, so we're talking about sending another 2,000 or so prisoners out of state. Will we expect, or should we expect from the Department of Corrections, an additional $50 million price tag every time we send an additional 2,000 prisoners out of state?
When we send inmates out of state, we ask for the augmentation from the legislature, and how I would describe it is that it's really a population shift, because you're not paying for the inmates that are in state. And we've had some discussion that it's at the marginal rate, so to me, we're paying for inmates to reduce overcrowding at the same cost that we're sending them out of state for, and you're just displacing the overcrowding, and it's not costing us any money.
But you're bringing on new bureaucrats. I'm not talking about the cost of the contract to send them out of state. I'm talking about the additional level of bureaucrats that you're bringing into CDCR in order to address that population.
Real fair, and the LAO said that when we do an overcrowding rate, we get 6-to-1 staffing. When the department adds 6 inmates to their prison, for every inmate overcrowding, we're getting 6-to-1 when we overcrowd in the prisons. So for every 6 inmates, we get 1 staff member of what, and it varies on what kind of staff member that is when we overcrowd in the prison. If you apply that rate to out of state would be is so far below that. It's whatever the math is, 37 positions to 2,400 inmates that we're asking for. If you took the staffing for 2,400 inmates, adding it in California, it would be that much more.
So as you transfer these 2,000 or so more inmates out of state, and you hire additional 37.5 positions, now because they're out of California's population and into the out-of-state population, will you be firing a number of bureaucrats within CDCR in order to, because now their positions are with the out-of-state versus the in-state?
Yes. The answer is that when we take the overcrowding down in the prisons...
Then why do you need an increase in the number of positions you're getting?
Yeah, it is just transferring them.
But no, it's not. It's an additional budget allocation.
But the population will adjust downward those inmates in the prison setting that are leaving. If I have a gymnasium of 100 people and I'm getting 6-to-1 for that 100, and I move those 100 out of state, and it's never just like that, but that I'm losing the 100-to-1, 6-to-1 staffing for that 100 overcrowded inmates.
But that's men on the ground, not management. I'm trying to understand. You're talking about oversight, not the hands-on folks. You're not talking about the guard who's watching the prisoner. You're talking about the guy who's keeping track of when he gets paroled and what his good time is.
I'm talking about all of them. Okay. I'm saying that correctional officers, administrative staff, whatever we got for 6-to-1 to cover that overcrowded inmates, we lose when they leave that prison. We lose that, and it goes back to the general fund. And then we're asking for the staffing augmentation for out-of-state based on the justifications provided in that BCP. And I understand what you're saying.
That doesn't make any sense to me. That's not how your budgeting is done. So what money did you send back to the general fund last year then to compensate for the prisoners you shipped out last year?
We reduced the overcrowding in the prisons by over 10,000.
I appreciate that. That's, I don't want our prisoners to be, I don't want to put our correctional officers in a position where they're overcrowded. I understand that's very tense work situation, serious safety issues. My question, though, is you're saying is that when we shift those folks to out of state, that the people who were in the management supervisorial positions now would shift to cover the out-of-state people, except you're saying, no, we're going to lay them off and return that money to the general fund and then do an additional budget request?
I just don't think I'm describing myself.
Perhaps.
The department loses the resources, management, line staff, whatever, that we get for the overcrowding. We lose that. When it's reduced, when the inmates are moved out of state or elsewhere, we lose the money in that prison and the staffing, be it a manager or a correctional officer.
But if you're overcrowded at 200%, and I'm sorry to belabor this, but if you're overcrowded at 200%, shifting out, a few dozen prisoners or a few hundred prisoners is not going to make you appropriately populated either. So you're still going to need those correctional officers on the line to watch the prisoners. I mean, I think instead of going in circles here, I mean, my concern is that we're talking about shifting a population and not seeing the appropriate savings from CDCR's management and supervisorial positions. That's my concern. That's my frustration. And that you're asking for additional positions when now so many tasks are being taken over by the out-of-state contract companies that I'm not sure exactly why we're not seeing more savings. That's my only point.
Okay. Thank you. Assemblymember Hagman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I've been dealing with this subject for quite a few years here, especially with a prison in our backyard. I just want to kind of clarify. I understand the ratio of positions as CIM and Chino goes up in population. We have to add on counselors, medical, correctional officers, administrators. That's the ratio you're talking about, the 6-to-1, especially because it's over capacity already.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So as we bring down 100 inmates out there, those 6 staffing paid positions out of general fund comes out of this pot of money, goes back in this pot of money. And this contractor asking for to go out of state needs to kind of almost transfer the funds from that part to this part. The problem is we never have enough money in either one of the funds, so you may not see a direct correlation or direct transfer from one budget line to another. But it's the staffing positions at all your facilities will go up and down as the ratio changes from week to week, month to month. My understanding, when I had my weekly meetings back down at CIM, we would get a weekly update of how many inmates were coming in, how many were going out, what the projections are for the next 2 or 3 months at a time, and those staffing levels would increase and decrease based on those ratios.
That's what I so eloquently tried to explain. Yes, sir.
Okay. So let's go back to the contract out of state. We also have to realize there's multiple different types of beds we're talking about. So even if California has all the beds it needs, which it won't for a long time, there's different types of beds depending on what type of sentencing requirements they have. So we have to make sure we're always talking about apples and apples and oranges depending on the classification of the inmate and that sort of thing, right?
Yes.
So when you go out for RFI, one may actually have a cheaper price. I know a lot of the county jails are looking into getting the state action too to balance their county budgets, but it's different type of beds sometimes in the county jails as they are in state prison, or the different type of jail beds we need for our prison inmates we're trying to relocate, which are generally the higher level of inmates, the ones for longer terms and those type of things. So you have to sort through that. We also have to go through. One question I had too is on the federal court orders. California's under the most heavy-handed federal court right now for any of our correctional operations. So we look at what they're telling us we have to do. Does that go with the inmate out of state?
That is exactly why the other states have backed off from taking our out-of-state inmates. I was in fervent discussions with Virginia about taking some of our inmates, and at the end of the day, they backed out because they said we didn't want your 40 class action lawsuits or your experts in our business, and they politely backed out.
And from the studies I've seen, we're not the worst of the worst of most state institutions. We're kind of in the middle of pretty much all the different categories, except for bed space at this point. But as far as quality treatment, death rates, all the rest of it, we're not at the bottom. But we just have this federal court kind of watching everything we do at this point. And so when we get to looking at transfer folks out of state, that oversight, that inspection, looking under the microscope, goes with not just our inmates, but to the facility they go to.
Yes, sir. And in any facility we deal with, and CCA has been especially patient with us. We were, the receiver's office suspended us, the out-of-state program, for over 6 months at one point. But they have been especially patient with us as we worked at it. They've added doctors, they've added, credentialing. They've taken what California does in its medical system and applied it to their private prison. And I believe that has driven some cost.
I also understand that one of the facilities, the one in Arizona, was actually kind of built to suit, basically built for overcrowding. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know. They had built...
not to suit, but they actually built it for our capacity or to have capacity that's available, but there's no long-term contract. So generally, if we build a facility, we're going to amortize those costs over a period of 30, in our case, a lot longer than that for our correctional facilities at this point. We will amortize that cost out. But you're only guaranteeing these providers basically 2 years worth, or actually 1 more year of services, unless the legislature gives you an extension on this stuff. So you can't really have new facilities built based on 1 year's contract at this point, nor can you amortize what the cost would be to upscale your staffing or your other needs to handle the additional facilities. So basically you have to look at infill beds, so what's available in the rest of the states, what has the basically same fit for our population that we need, that are willing to go through the hoops that we are forced to go under with the federal courts, and who has the capacity right now for that. So that kind of narrows down the field of what's available real quickly when you start putting those things out. Now, if we're looking at doing this on a permanent basis, say, hey, for the next 30 years we're doing this, I think you will see a lot of things pop up all over the place, and because they can amortize those costs of building and construction and those programs meant to those services, and you can probably see that. So I feel your pain when you go out for RFIs, RFPs. I think you will, when I study this stuff, you're getting a pretty good deal of what you're getting right now. At the same time, to go through that process, like Mr. Rambo said, I think is a good, healthy process. I think you'll end up with the same results when you actually go through that, because there's just not that many open beds out there in the states that will do all the things we need it to do. And I think one of the things we could look at the legislature as, well, why can't everybody else do it so much cheaper? Notwithstanding the courts telling us to do everything. But really, when it comes down to prison construction and maybe the non-public safety personnel, how can we outsource that? And it's different for different areas. I would like to see us kind of strive to give the Department of Corrections the tools it needs to respond quickly and to become more efficient in every way we can. So I'd love to have some dialogues with that in the future, because we do need to try to eventually bring that back. Considering if we could build the prison for the same going rate as the rest of the country, we could somehow get our programming costs closely, then it would make a lot more sense, A, to keep the jobs here, but B, we don't have the transportation costs, you have all that kind of stuff that we should be able to compete on a cheaper level than what we're doing right now. And if you're looking at a $50,000 per bed for a regular bed price versus a $25,000 bed per year price, that's double. We have some serious issues in our system here, notwithstanding the critical need of let's comply with the federal court order, or try to the best we can for the next few years. So we'll still be an emergency, but with that long-term plan is how do we get our costs down? Yes, sir. That's my comments.
Assemblymember Rambler.
Mr. Kiernan, I have taken several deep breaths, so let's start again. I accept that overcrowding is a problem. It's a problem for the men and women that work in the institutions. It's also a problem for all of us residents of California, because we're getting inmates who, because of overcrowding, don't get the rehabilitation that they should be getting, so that they can come out less likely to offend again, contributing to our horrendous recidivism problems. And I accept, regardless of the dollars or the particular financial stuff, I accept that it's probably cheaper for now for us to contract out of state than it is to do it in state, and certainly quicker, I think. Keep in mind, though, that what we're trying to get is the best possible deal for the state, just because of the very difficult financial situation that we find ourselves in. Every dollar that we spend in one area is one less dollar for other areas which are very worthy and crying out for some financial resources. What I want to do, though, is clarify just a little point, and that is AB 900 was the legislature's approval of allowing the transfer of inmates out of state, correct? I mean, before that, before AB 900, we couldn't involuntarily transfer an inmate out of state.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so now we can involuntarily transfer an inmate out of state, and we're sending them to places like Mississippi. Can we not send them to places like Mexico? Is that not even a better value, potentially? Does that merit exploring the possibilities of housing? I mean, it's a hell of a lot closer than Mississippi.
I think
we share a border.
It's a very interesting question that I don't know really the answer to. We did not consider international transfer of inmates. And I know this, with all the discussions, the higher level inmates that were really overcrowded in the level 3s and 4s, my staff in the state prisons in California do it the best, better than anybody. And I would never want to ship out our higher end gang members and bad guys either internationally or even out of state. But having said that, I think there is some level of population that can be safely housed out of state until we can build capacity. So I'm not skirting your question. I just don't think it's been contemplated to go internationally.
There's not a Corrections Corporation of Mexico?
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that because I think, to kind of come full circle, we had to make certain decisions because of the press of time several years ago. I would suggest that even though there's a lot of moving pieces, that the court decisions, the 3-judge panel, and whether that's successfully appealed or not, some of the actions the legislature took, albeit not as far as we should have last year, but there were some efforts to reduce overcrowding. It seems to me that now we have a little bit more time, and that perhaps we need to step back and look at all of our options. And frankly, I mean, I like competition. I think that companies will sharpen their pencils when they realize that they have a competitor, and maybe we can have them look at picking up some of the costs if they know that it's not a guaranteed deal that they're going to get. So it just seems to me that maybe now is the time to revisit some of our actions. And
I can't tell you how sorry I am. I can't tell you how sorry I am that I caused you to take deep breaths, and it really was not my intent. From an operational perspective, understanding what my staff are going through every day, and the safety to the public safety that we get by the out-of-state program, I'm pretty passionate that we did a good job and tried to do it as competitively and fairly as we could. But your point's very well taken, sir. And
that's why I stress, let's not focus on the past. We can't do much about that. But let's focus on what steps we can take going forward that can get us as good of a deal as possible. And I'm a firm believer that competition tends to bring out the best, or at least helps people sharpen their pencils. So to the extent that we can get the private sector involved in this situation that we painted ourselves into, I think it would do the taxpayers some good, and it might allow us, it might buy us some breathing room so that we can get our act together in state.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Assemblymember Jeffries.
Yeah, if I could sort of back up a little bit and then take you off track at the same time. Kind of going back to Ms. Strickland's comments about some savings, but in a different venue. That is something I pay close attention to, and that is the reduction or potential elimination of the inmate fire crews, hand crews. Last information I had was roughly 50% or more of the conservation camps will be eliminated by the release of low-level offenders. They're the only ones that qualify. First question is, do you have any figures related to that? And second, if there are, the savings associated with that, could they be used to apply to other programs?
think that the tools, if that was the right word that was used, that was given to us by the legislature to reduce population, specifically non-revocable parole, will have very little impact on our firefighting camps. I know, I was just called to a meeting the other day, the administration is absolutely committed to keeping those critical fire life safety services provided, even if it requires us, sir, to take a look at the criteria that we use to which we put inmates out to the fire camps. So I think I would answer your question is that we have no contemplation of reducing the capacity of our fire camps with the reform measures at this point or anything else further. We're going to keep them staffed.
Which leads me to my second question, because I had heard that the criteria was potentially going to change, and what was going to be replacing low-level offenders was somewhat higher-risk offenders on those crews, which would change the dynamics of those who work on those crews, both in CAL FIRE and in your agency. And then, of course, because those facilities are minimum best facilities with, you virtually walk out if you want. If they are higher-risk offenders, do we not then have some costs associated with changing the makeup of the facilities?
I think we would do nothing to jeopardize public safety and put a violent offender out in those fire camps. So please let me be very clear about that. I think the things that we're looking at, some of the things we're looking at is I think it's 5 years. An offender can be doing no more than 5 years to go out to a fire camp. What does that do for us if we lose let's just, for the sake of argument, 100 inmates because of these reform efforts? What if we went to 5 years and 6 months? Does that give us enough a pool? And is that a great enough risk? And that's just one example. Our classification criteria has a lot of variables that will allow us to potentially expand that population. And I also say that the fire camps is, with the action taken by the legislature, gives 2 days off for every day served while you're in a fire camp. So it's very desirous for the offenders. And I believe that inmates would go out there, even if their classification level or some other criteria was a little larger. I think the work that the fire camps do could be managed, but we will not take any undue risk with public safety.
So at this point, your position is there will be no reduction in fire crews?
There will be no reductions.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. I have some final questions here regarding, we've talked a lot about RFP versus RFI, and I thought the LAO presentation hit it right on the head. It's a market survey. That's all it was, and that's not good enough. That doesn't meet our needs. I have some charts that your office gave to us regarding the first RFI. There is nothing on this chart regarding cost. The second one, the second RFI, does have a whole section on costs and comments. And the third one does have costs as well. So clearly it was an evolving process in terms of your RFIs and the information you were requesting, and it got a little more detailed over time. But this does not meet the standards of an RFP, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. This is from the State Administrative Manual from DGS. Request for proposals must be. This is the I'm quoting from section 5.15a. A request for proposals must be as precise as possible to ensure that all proposals are accomplishing the same goal. A market survey doesn't do that. Section D, a comprehensive evaluation plan must be developed and finalized. All rating and scoring factors which are to be considered must be included. Criteria for considering costs to the state must be developed, and the evaluation plan must provide for a fair and equitable evaluation of all proposals. D2, all proposals and all evaluation and scoring sheets must be available for public inspection at the conclusion of the scoring process. There's a whole page here looking at the objectives of the RFP, and it has a statement of work, specifications, time schedules, etc., that they have to submit. And then finally, this is, again, according to the manual, The bidding process often takes 3 to 8 months from the time advertisement is placed. I don't think a modified RFP that incorporates a lot of these key features that is expedited, again, per the emergency authority that was granted, would be a problem in terms of getting this done. You could get it done in, it seems to me, if 3 months is the low end of a normal process, you could scrunch up your process to make it hit 3 months. And that would not unnecessarily delay the process. Again, the thing that caught my attention that led to this hearing today was that we went from a $20 million or so contract in 2006 to a $630 billion contract today. That's what got my attention. And that every step of the way there, you relied on an RFI, not an RFP, to step up, to ramp up. Assemblymember Hagman talked about apples and oranges. And as I look at these charts, you've got, Podunk County somewhere outside of California offering 16 beds. Well, you're comparing that with, the private vendors in some of the other states. That doesn't. If there was an expectation that was set out at the outset from CDCR that we need about 1,000 beds or 2,000 beds or something large, well, Podunk County would not have submitted. But somehow they're in the mix here, and again, this is just a market survey. This is nothing more than that, and that's not, as I said earlier, it's not what we need. It's not what the taxpayers need from CDCR. Question regarding the receiver. You mentioned that some of the receiver costs for the health component are also added into your budget. I thought the receiver had their own budget and they did their own thing. What are you doing in relation to these prisoners going out of state that is receiver focused?
There's resources in all of the prisons that do screening. And it's the nurses that would otherwise be doing sick calls. When we give them the name of a potential eligible inmate, they screen them. So the receiver staff has been very good about, as we, and I said one person. It's actually we've targeted thousands in our system to see if they're eligible to get the appropriate pool of offenders transferred. The receiver staff have done the work of making sure they don't have any serious medical or mental health issues in the prison. In addition to that, they have medical records staff, for example, that maintain the records just like on the correctional side, maintain all the medical records, respond to inquiries. When the facility has to send an inmate out of state, they're going through the receiver's office ultimately to make sure that was an appropriate expenditure. And so there's those resources. And then there's teams. If there's a serious incident out, a death in one of the facilities, the receiver's office will send a medical team out to evaluate, the incident to make sure that it was appropriate actions taken. So a number of things like that the receiver's office has been involved in. Some of the positions are within their budget. Some of the money for providing the screenings that I mentioned, I believe, is in our budget. And so that's how we work it out with them.
Okay, so it's fungible. It goes back and forth between the two.
Yes, sir.
We had some difficulty, staff had some difficulty getting some communication between the governor's office and CDCR, and we will be resubmitting some very specific requests. I think essentially the argument was that some of this communication was privileged. We're going to be much more specific in what we ask for, and we'll be seeking that information in terms of the communication back and forth between CDCR at the governor's office. And the expectation is that it'll be information that we can use in budget sub 4 a couple of months from now. In terms of my questions, that's it. Are there any other questions or issues? Oh, I'm sorry. There was something that came up in the LAO presentation regarding the incentives for the current vendor to send people out of the prison to get medical care if then we're the ones who end up paying for them when they go outside of the prison as opposed to getting treated inside. How does that piece of the contract work?
the on-site doctor makes the on-site decision if an individual has to go out of state, depending. I mean, out of the facility, right there. And so then, of course, there's records with that, and that was a little bit of the receiver resources to make sure that the vendor is doing it appropriately. In all of my reviews of it, there has not been any instance that I'm aware of where the private company has inappropriately sent out an individual to an outside hospital, and the receiver's office verifies that for us.
Okay. And in terms of conflicts over that process, who decides? Is it the receiver's office?
Well, I mean, again, if it's an emergency, then, the private company has the authority to send that guy out and get him the help that he needs, and we'll deal with any discussion out of it. I suppose if there was a specialty of some sort, any serious specialty, oncology or something like that, we would transfer the inmate back to California and provide the services here. So my memory of the costs were very minimal compared to the overall contract for excess medical.
And then this will be my last question before we take public comment. In terms of there was something that you were just saying that I was queuing on. Maybe I'll remember when the public comment comes up. But thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Anybody in the audience wishing to speak on the issues at hand today? If you can come to that, you can come up to the desk.
Helen Roth Dowden, SEIU Local 1000. We represent the teachers and some of the clerical folks within the prisons. I'm concerned about the fact that you're adding these new positions at the same time that 800 teachers are losing their jobs by the end of this month. And I would think that if you're adding new positions at the same time that we will see 600 teachers, some who have been there, 200 vacant positions, we think. They haven't really given us a number. But another 600 positions that are just teachers, some of them have been there 25 years, that you're letting go at the same time you're hiring these additional staff. I would at least, if these positions are going to be available, let some of those teachers possibly look at taking those positions rather than losing what we're doing right now, because we have, we are just decimating these programs. We've cut these education programs at half. If you're going to send people out of prison, I would like to, out of state for prisons, I'd like to know what what we're looking at in terms of outcomes. If people are in these education and vocational programs, what is the recidivism rate of the people in those programs? Are we demanding any of those kinds of outcome data of the folks that are going in these out-of-state prisons? Thank you.
Thank you.
Liberty Sanchez on behalf of the California Public Defenders Association. The concerns we have to do with a lot of unknowns about the prisoners that have been shipped out of state in terms of access to family, access to resources while imprisoned out of state, credit for program completion, program participation. We recognize that there was a provision in the contract that programs be required to be provided, but we aren't sure about whether or not those programs have in fact been provided, whether prisoners are disenfranchised to that end by being shipped out of state. And we have to recall that even if they're shipped out of state, when they are released, the majority of them are going to come back and live in the communities in which we all live here. And it's very important to remember that recidivism increases when prisoners upon release don't have access to appropriate reentry services. It's very hard on prisoners when they don't have any communication with family and have no ability to report abuse, no ability to demand services where there's mistreatment and, these problems are exacerbated when they're so far from home. So for those reasons, we have continued concern about how this program is working. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Pam Handel, and I am a teacher in DJJ, which is one of those CDCR teachers. My concern every time I come and talk to you folks is the students that are the DJJ age, and it is well known by teachers, at least in CDCR, that in both divisions, that there are students over in the adult division that are fairly young. And one of my concerns as I listen to all of this is, are any of them being considered or have already been considered for movement out of this state, whether voluntary or involuntary? And we are not overcrowded in DJJ, and we would gladly accept them back where they probably should be anyway, because we can better care for their educational needs and some of their treatment needs because of their age and everything else. And that possibly would take care of some things. But I just would like for you to think about that and DJJ as an option for some of these folks. I talk to teachers all the time in CDC, and they say they have 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds. They know that they had special education needs, but there they are in the adult division when they should probably be back with us. So that's just a seed that I'd like to plant and let that soak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're one short of a quorum. But we'll go ahead and start. We'll go over the recommendations today, and if someone arrives, then we'll vote, and if not, we'll.
Mr. Chairman, I was looking at from our discussions, I have just a couple amendments on the statements, and to see if you're acceptable or not. We heard from the CDCR it takes anywhere from 7 to 8 months to do a full RFP, given the fact that it takes a little bit of time. I was thinking that we could maybe add to the first point. That they can no longer do it after a certain point in time that we think they could get that time to do it. So let's say we picked October 1st of 2010. Any time after that, they would have to go through RFP now. But I'm saying if another incident happens, we lose another 2,000 beds somewhere, that time between now and then to be able to respond. So there's some kind of point and date and time that after that date, we're going to want to see that they went through the RFP process to do that. Would be my suggestion for that. And then with the second point, it basically says do not add the 37.5 positions, but we also heard that they have ratios of 6 to 1 on the overcrowding portion. So I think if they could demonstrate that they lose, my math shows me it's over 300 positions. If they actually transfer this, they're losing 300 positions on the overcrowding versus gaining 40 positions on the out-of-state side. If they could show that in the budget committee where they actually had the savings of even double or triple that in position cuts on one side, then it obviously makes sense to add them on the other side. Like somehow tie in those two, because that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, I think both of those are reasonable requests. I think rather than having a date certain, I think asking that they do a modified RFP process. I read some of I don't know if you were here, some of the key features of an RFP. If those key features were part of what they did, I think we all would be okay, because then there would be transparency, and that's all we're seeking here. So rather than saying to holding a formal competitive bidding process, maybe a modified formal competitive bidding process. So that would allow for them to
I just want to make sure in the short term, if something comes up, they haven't.
Or an expedited.
Yeah, a way to deal with the issues.
Expedited. And then on the second issue, the issue is the net effect. Adjusting for the loss of staffing at the in-state with the in-state population. So we'll wordsmith that as well, that it reflects that, so that in the budget subcommittee we can get that information.
Okay. So I'll move those.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. The vice chair is on her way. So we'll go ahead and start the roll call now, and you guys can head out.
De la Torre.
Aye.
Strickland. Arambula. Berryhill. Block. Buchanan. Caballero. Emerson. Fletcher. Fuentes. Hagman. Huber. Jeffries. Jones. Lowenthal. Perez, Valines.
Thank you very much. We'll keep the roll open for another, till 12:30. Take care of the home. You know what? The home fires. She's